Hi everyone, and welcome to the September Avert webinar. I'd like to open the session by acknowledging the lands on which we're meeting today. So I'm meeting from Ngunnawal lands. This webinar is going to be recorded and it will be available on both the Avert website and the Avert YouTube channel. Just a reminder, so when you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and not the chat, because they get lost and hidden in the chat, and the Q&A I can keep track of them all. And yeah, so here we go. So I would like to introduce our speaker today. So today we have Dr. Emma Belton. So Emma is a postdoctoral research fellow at both the University of Queensland and the Australian National University. Her research concentrates on radicalisation pathways, found extremist risk assessment, and evaluating CV initiatives in custodial and community settings. Previously, Emma was the project manager for the ARC-funded project responsible for developing the database she's going to talk about today, the PIRA database, and she holds a PhD in criminology from the University of Queensland, with her doctoral research examining the traits of individual radicalisation and violent extremism in Australia, aiming to enhance understanding of risk factors linked to both violent and non-violent extremists. So I will let Emma share her screen and take it away.
Okay, let's see if I can do this. Okay. Also, thank you, Emily, for that very, very warm welcome. Now, I want to make sure, what can everyone see right now?
We can see your screen.
Perfect. That's what you need to see. Excellent. All right. So I'll get started because I tend to be a bit of a talker. So today I want to talk to you guys about the database that Emily just mentioned. It's the Profiles of Individual Radicalisation in Australia database. I have been working on this database since 2018, which is terrifying when you say it out loud. It was a part of an ARC project that Professor Adrian Cherney actually was granted, and he pulled me on as a research assistant back then. And eventually it led to me actually sort of leading the project, which has been a very, very long, how many years now? 5, 6, 7 years. So I'll get started, but essentially this database is now being made available for open access. So it's essentially available to anyone, and you can download the data set and use it, and it's very exciting. And so I'm going to talk to you guys today about that and what it is. So the first thing I'll talk about is what actually is PIRA. I'm going to talk about its overview and how it was developed. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why we have decided to make it open access and the purpose of it, and some research applications, including some research that has already been conducted and potential future applications. And then, of course, how do you access it? So let's go. So what is it? So this database collects individual level data on individuals who have radicalised to extremism in Australia, who have engaged in various types of behaviours, and not just those that have been convicted of terrorist offences. And it was modelled off an existing database in the United States, so the Profiles of Individual Radicalisation in the United States. And this database was actually used as a scaffolding to create the sort of Australian version of it. And the idea was that we wanted to create data that could be used to look at pathways, risk factors, behavioural patterns of extremists in Australia. It's important to note, and I'll talk about this a bit later, but it's actually a partial replication. And I say that because there's been some changes, modifications. Obviously, us and the US are both Western democratic countries, but there are some differences. It was led by Adrian and myself and a few RAs. And essentially it was used to sort of create more research that was using aggregated data and identifying patterns, because a lot of the research in Australia previous to this tended to rely on things like case studies and sort of smaller sample sizes. So the PIRA database and the public access PIRA are different. So I'm going to talk about, obviously, the one that's publicly available and why it's slightly different and the reasons for that. So as I said, it collects individuals who have radicalized to extremism. Obviously, the open access database is de-identified for confidentiality reasons. And it collects data on individual offenders between 1985 and 2023. So it's quite exhaustive in its time span. It includes 114 variables that range hugely from backgrounds all the way to plot details to group identification. And again, I'll talk about this in more detail as we go. So it is quantitative individual level data. And currently, the open access version has 261 extremists, both violent and non-violent. And it covers a broad ideological range. So it's not focused on just a specific type of ideology. So for example, it's not focused just on jihadists or far right, or it's essentially collects data on anyone who is engaged in behavior that is ideologically motivated in any way over the last sort of 30, 40 years. So I want to talk about the ideology a little bit. So last year I gave a workshop for the high-risk terrorist offender branch and a couple of stakeholders using the qualitative data from PIRA, which has a lot more explicit detail in the ideologies. Now, what happened is when I presented these case studies, instead of assessing the cases for the level of risk, which is what I asked them to do, they tried to play detective and find out who the individuals were. So to avoid having the individual's identities exposed or being able to deduce based on the information who that person might be, because we do have a relatively low rate of offending that's extremist based in Australia. So the data essentially is categorized into four broad ideologies. So you've got far right, Islamist, and far left and single issue. And as you can see here, the breakdown is obviously heavily weighted towards Islamists, and I'm going to also tell you a bit about why that might be. So as it stands, we've got 11% of the data captures far-right extremists, and that is predominantly looking at neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and if any of you are local here in Australia, you will know that's quite the hot topic at the moment based on the protesting that happened over the weekend. So far rights include people associated with the Nationalist Socialist Network, which is led by Tom Sewell, which was also in the news this morning, I believe. But what's interesting is that a lot of these cases have been identified in the last 10 years. So prior to that, there wasn't a lot of instances of far right or captured, or we didn't have the information. And in the last couple of years now, we're seeing a rise in sovereign citizens being included into the database. And I'll explain who and why and how they're included. Prior to that, it was very heavily Islamist or jihadist based. A lot of that was to do with the call of the caliphate in 2011 by ISIS. The earlier cases historically were very Al-Qaeda aligned. And then from then, it sort of swayed more towards the Islamic State. Now, although 82% is quite high, 50% of those were actually foreign fighters or jihadi brides, which means that half of those individuals actually engaged in extremist behavior outside of Australia. So I think that's important to note as well. And the database does capture these differences in types of behavior that they engage in. Far left single issue, much less prevalent. A lot of nationalists, like libertarian socialists, and they were more predominant back in the 90s. So not as common now. We only have one single issue extremist who was an anti-abortionist who ended up killing 2 people, but that was back in 2001. So we're seeing a bit of a trend, which is quite interesting, I think. So I'll explain to you what the difference is. So the actual PIRA database itself that has information that is not available to the public covers individuals from 1985 to now, so 2025. And it has 265 individuals, and it includes qualitative case notes. So what that means is it's for each profile that we collect data on, we gather first a qualitative case study or profile of that individual, we then convert that into numeric data. So we have quantitative and qualitative data. It also captures 123 variables. Now, the open access version is a little bit more limited. There's a few less individuals, and the data is quantitative. So it's only aggregate data. It is just numbers. And again, that's to ensure that people's identities are kept safe. And a lot of the variables that were excluded were things that could have alluded to that person's identity, or weren't captured quantitatively in the first place. Okay, where are we now? So I'm realizing the order of this is probably slightly confusing, and I'm very sorry about that. So to actually be included in the database, it's the same inclusion criteria that was used for the US version. So essentially, the individual had to have committed some sort of ideologically motivated behavior. And that could be violent or non-violent. So for example, that could have been funding a terrorist organization, that could have been recruiting others into an extremist movement, or that could have been committing a terrorist act. So they had to have done that. And this means they could have also been killed due to their extremist beliefs. So that would be people that would leave the country to enter a conflict zone and engage in warfare or join a terrorist organization over there. Most predominantly for Australia, we're looking at ISIS, the foreign fighters that left around between 2012 and 2016. Or they joined a terrorist organization, or they associated with a group or organization that was extremist or known to be extremist. So in Australia, as things go, as the threat landscapes changes, we're seeing that more organizations are being listed in what we call a designated terrorist organization. So essentially that's the government saying this group is a terrorist organization. We also have other groups that are not necessarily on that list, but could be considered extremists. So they're also included as well. They had to be radicalised in Australia, obviously. It's an Australian database, that makes sense. They had to be ideologically motivated in their actions. And this last one is really important. The behaviour they engaged in, there had to be a direct link to show that that was ideologically motivated. So I'll give you an example of what that isn't. So if you have a weapons dealer who is selling weaponry to a terrorist organization but is not associated, affiliated, but is more a criminal transaction, it's a bit of a gray area, but essentially we had to make sure that their behaviors were a direct result of their belief system. Okay, I hope everyone's still with me. So because we included the inclusion criteria in and of itself is quite broad. The important thing about this is it enables us to also capture extremists from all of the ends of the spectrum. So historically or previously in a lot of research, we would look at individuals who have committed a terrorist offense, and we would sort of use that and conduct research based on those types of samples, which makes sense. The issue with that is it tends to exclude individuals that may be ideologically motivated or may be extremist or hold violent ideologies, but haven't acted on them in a violent way, or they weren't charged for the offense. So this database aims to capture a very, very nuanced sample of individuals who might be ideologically sympathizers, but haven't actually engaged in anything we would deem as terrorist or extremist. And this is because historically those cases were excluded, but it's important if we want to understand radicalisation, we have to understand those that hold the same beliefs but don't act on them. So we call this the specificity problem in terrorism research, which essentially is why is it that two individuals who have the same background, the same histories, the same risk factors, only one of them will go on to join a terrorist organization. So that was sort of the aim there. What does it include? So as I said, there was 114 variables. There is 114 variables in the public access version. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to give you guys a sense of what the data actually looks like and what we capture. So obviously we look at demographics, we look at things like their background, so their histories, their upbringing, did they have any adverse childhood events, any particular vulnerabilities, so mental health issues, any history of drug and alcohol use, and that includes things like criminogenic factors, so factors that we would look at in traditional offending, and we use them here as well to see if, you know, these might be relevant. So that's things like, do they have a criminal history? Do they have a history of violence? Did they have a particularly adverse upbringing, trauma, abuse, those types of things? So it also captures the specific types of behavior they engaged in. And I say terrorist related, and that's essentially just the behavior that they did or that they were involved in. So that can be things like planning a terrorist attack. This can be planning to fly overseas as a foreign fighter. This can be gathering weaponry. It can be recruiting others. So it's quite broad, but it gives a very clear detail of how these events carried out and the types of actions they took. So it could be, did they gather extremist material? Did they learn how to make an IED in their bedroom? So things like that. It also includes legal outcomes. So that's obviously if they were charged, if they were convicted, and it also includes any legislative restrictions. So I'm going to talk about this in detail later because we're quite different in that sense compared to other countries. Talks about their group affiliation, were they a member of a terrorist organization? And if they were, for how long? What was their role? It looks at family members and their peers and their group networks. We also included their online behavior. So this was, did they use the internet as part of their motivation to engage in this behavior, or did they use it to supplement what they were doing? And this includes social media use, the platform. How often did they use it? What did they post? Did they create propaganda? So those sorts of things. And then when we capture measures that are directly related to radicalization based on the literature and the empirical evidence. So that essentially is, where were they radicalized? Was there an event preceding their radicalization? Was there, were they socially isolated? Did they engage with or see, sorry, did they react to something that a certain government did? So they're quite broad, but we tried to cover as much as we could. And obviously it talks about their beliefs, their belief system, and it talks about their grievances. And we captured this at the individual, group, and global level. So did they have an individual grievance? Was it related to how they identified with the group and that group felt marginalized, or was it more global than that? Okay. So this is actually how we collected the data. Now, this is an open source database. Again, and I'll come back to this, but open sources are essentially anything that is publicly available. So this is court transcripts, journalistic media, government reports, police press releases, those types of things. To code the data and to code for each profile, we used a code book, or created a code book that sets out very clearly how each variable is conceptualized, how to code it, and what it actually is trying to measure. We conducted intercoder reliability. So we had myself and I believe 5 research assistants over the period of the 6 years. And for 10% of the cases that we coded, I conducted inter-rater reliability to ensure that we were essentially coding the same way. And off the top of my head, I think the alpha was 0.89. And for those that don't know what that is, it's good. It essentially means that we were coding quite similarly. We did a lot of data triangulation, so we tended to rely on more robust sources. So that would be things like official court reports as opposed to news articles. And we did make some few changes, like I mentioned earlier, to make them more context specific to Australia. So because in Australia compared to, for example, the US, I believe the PIRUS has over 2,000 cases now. So obviously that's quite a difference. And that's maybe a good thing for us. But essentially that means that because the prevalence rates are lower, we had to account for that. And there are certain things that were captured in the US that weren't really relevant to the Australian context. So one of them, a really easy one, is terminology. So they use misdemeanor for minor offenses. We use summary offense. So things like that had to be changed. And in the code book, you'll see, which I'll show you, how to identify where the variables actually came from. So we actually included extra variables that PIRUS didn't have. One of them was social isolation. I think we added about 13 additional variables. And if you go to the code book, you'll see the source. And if it says the source is PIRA, it means it wasn't present in PIRUS. And now my thing's going the wrong way. So, as I was saying, the modifications we did make are also outlined in the code book. So it will say it was adapted or changed in a way. So it will still have been captured in PIRUS, but we might measure it a bit differently. And there were also some variables that we excluded altogether. And I'm going to talk very quickly about these types of techniques that were put into place to try to mitigate some of the limitations with using publicly available data, which I'll also talk to the limitations of what they are. But what we did effectively is we were very explicit when it came to coding certain variables. And I'm just going to call them defaults because that's the easiest way to explain them. And the purpose of this was try to reduce the variability amongst coders. So as you'll see here is under each variable or some variables, they'll have a note and it will say, you know, if this person engaged in this behavior, code them as this. So foreign fighters is a good example. It just makes it easier for us to aggregate the data. And because these cases are so complex, this was a way of us to try to mitigate some of those issues. The other one was to try to avoid missing data, which is hugely inherent to these types of databases. So for some variables where it was reasonable, so things like having a criminal history, usually in most cases, information will explicitly state whether they had a criminal history. It's not something they tend to omit. So in those cases, instead of saying we don't know, you would code it as no. Similar for things like mental illness, certainly not for other variables that look at things like psychological mechanisms, attitudes, those things you can't really put these types of things in place because you can't assume someone's beliefs or their attitude. I hope everyone's still with me. So I want to talk about the limitations with open sources. They're inherent with all open source data sets, primarily things like lots of missing data. There can be bias in reporting. So particularly in news articles, you'll see that it tends to be a bit of a predisposition to report on certain types of offenders or offending. This obviously causes some inconsistency and bias. And the other thing as well is when you're coding with open sources, having to conceptualize very complex variables can be quite difficult because you can't really, without having more closed source data or like things like interviews or sort of confidential police data, it's much harder to capture those things. And I'm going to use online variables as an example. Obviously, people's online use is public. However, you can't really capture the nuances in it. So when we were conceptualizing social media use, you know, we had to be pretty black and white about it. So it was did they use it a lot? Did they use it not a lot? You know, was it a huge influence or was it a minor influence? And again, with the platform, you know, we had to sort of be very strategic in what we were doing. The thing I will say, stop doing that. The thing I will say though is Australia is somewhat unique in the sense of the availability we have to certain types of information that other countries might not have. So open access here is actually quite different to open access in other Western liberal countries, so the US, the UK, and Europe. And I'll explain why this is, but because we don't have as many limitations on access, it means that the data is actually more primarily sourced from reliable data. So the first one is court transcripts. So a lot of the profiles relied really heavily on court documents because they are hugely accessible here. Almost 70% of the profiles had a court transcript associated with it. And this might sound like 70% of them were convicted of a terrorist offense, but that's not the case. And I'll explain why. Essentially, these were things like sentencing, legislative orders, which I'll talk about. And a lot of these contain things like psychological reports. They explicitly name associates or other extremists, and they are available to the public. And we don't have as many privacy laws or provisions compared to similar countries. Another thing that's quite unique to Australia is we do have a lot of terrorism legislation. And that includes legislation that extends beyond convicting people of terrorist offences. So we have a few, I don't know what you would call them. What would you call them? I can't think of what you would call them. Essentially, they're provisions that allow Australia to essentially extend someone's sentence beyond the time they have served. And they're all listed here, and I'm not going to explain what they are, but essentially what these are is they're also publicly available because they're associated with terrorism. So these also relate to individuals who have not been convicted of terrorist offences. So if someone is serving a sentence for an unrelated offence, we are able to serve them with post-sentence orders if they are deemed a threat of committing a terrorist act. And within these, they're very explicit on why that person is considered a risk. So it's very clear the behavior they engaged in, the activity, why they're concerned that they're a risk to the public. And as I said, these people aren't necessarily terrorist offenders. And these are becoming more prominent. And the other thing about these is in addition to offenders who were convicted of a terrorist offense, if they are given a control order, that will also be very explicit about the people they cannot engage with, what they cannot do, where they cannot go. So these types of sources of information were used a lot, essentially as like a snowballing effect, where you would find one and it would name 3 other people who are associated with some sort of extremist group. And we would sort of go and explore on who that person is, which is why a lot of our cases are pretty much most of the information is derived from these types of documents. And the other thing is that our terrorist incidents are much lower here in Australia, but that also means that they're really publicised when they do occur, particularly if they are arrested for a type of offence. So that's essentially how it changes, or it's maybe a bit different to other open sources in that we have access to more reliable data. So why did we make it public access? I've already sort of mentioned this, and why is it important and who can use it and what's the point, right? I also am aware that I'm talking about data and that's inherently really boring, and I'm sorry about that. But effectively, it just means that people in the field or associated fields can conduct research. It also means that policymakers and practitioners who work in the space in ideologically motivated violence, wow, can use this as a source of information to help understand the risk factors associated with certain types of offenders. It can help them understand the backgrounds, who they might be, not who they might be associated with, but if they have associations, their age, sort of all, and those types of things that would be helpful. So in this part, I'm only actually going to talk about the research utility, because I've sort of already mentioned this, and I'm going to move on because I'm rambling now. So I'm going to talk about some research that's already been conducted using PIRA. So this is something that was published a couple of years ago, and it essentially looked at backgrounds and risk factors, prevalence rates in Australia of offenders who engaged in both violent and non-violent extremism. And it, broke down the ideological composition. It looked at those very prominent risk factors that we see a lot in terrorism research. So, 70% had a grievance. And most of them had a peer who was radicalized or was considered an extremist. This is obviously something you can go and look at yourself. It is published. But this is the type of data or the type of information that can be sort of derived from using PIRA. Another paper that we published was looking at youth radicalization, which is a very big hot topic at the moment, and I will talk about that in a second, but it looked at extremist youth specifically, and if there were factors that were unique to them compared to perhaps older adults. So we looked at what place was significant in their radicalization. Was there a specific place that actually accelerated or initiated or exposed them to extremist groups or individuals? We looked at their social media engagement. We looked at the prevalence of mental health, which was actually quite high comparative to the general population and also the other individuals in PIRA that were not considered youth. Again, this is something you can look at in your own time. This was my thesis research, actually, and what I looked at was individuals who had engaged in behavior here in Australia and looked at the relationship between factors and mechanisms that could explain why certain individuals go on to engage in violent behavior rather than non-violent. So why did some individual decide to stab a priest compared to funding a terrorist organization from afar? And what I found effectively was that these four concepts or these four mechanisms work together to increase the risk of violence. So if they were socially isolated, if one of their family members was an extremist, if they were part of a sort of informal extremist group, so not an actual maybe terrorist organization, but another group of extremists, and if they were more committed to their belief system. And so obviously this has implications for risk assessment. It has implications for prevention and people in de-radicalization or disengagement programs to identify that these are salient in pushing someone to perhaps act more violently than others. The second aspect of research, rather than sort of risk factors and radicalization pathways, is the fact that PIRA can be used to essentially facilitate international comparisons with other data sources, which has actually just been done, which I will tell you about. It also allows us to conduct analyses that differentiate extremist roles or extremist behavior to then identify factors that are particularly unique for that type of offending or that type of role. So this is an example of what that sort of looks like. And again, this was also from my thesis, which I'm trying to publish. But if any of you have done a PhD, you'll know that the last thing you want to do when you're finished is go back and read it. So I looked at these different levels of risk factors and if some of them were more prevalent or could predict violence compared to non-violence, and found that in fact there are a few that do that. So being isolated, having high levels of anger and anger towards Australia specifically. And these factors here were actually the most significant, followed by group dynamics, which is not particularly surprising, and then some more contextual factors. So was there a type of policy that the government implemented that they didn't like and that accelerated their radicalization? So things like that. This is an example of sort of an international comparison that was so Lorne Dawson and Garth Davis, sorry, they're researchers from Canada, which I'm sure a lot of you know. So Garth was actually, I believe, the one who was in charge of creating the Canadian version of PIRUS and PIRA. And we actually have just submitted a study that looks at how criminal backgrounds for jihadists in particular change across country, what their influence might be, what type of criminal engagement, does it change across ideology, and actually used these 3 different countries to run a comparison to essentially challenge the crime terror nexus that is a big argument in literature at the moment. So that's currently under review, which is exciting. Okay, I've got 4 minutes left. Let's do it. It's pretty self-explanatory on how to actually get access to the data. There's a link here, click the link, right? What you'll see is there's 3 sort of files or things that you need to be aware of when you're using the data. Obviously, the first one is the data set itself. It is in an Excel spreadsheet. To use the data, you need to get the code book, because otherwise it's just going to be a bunch of numbers that don't make any sense. So you need to use the code book. And you also, there's a sort of public release statement which outlines licensing terms and conditions, sort of how to use it and the potential limitations with the data set. And look, I even showed you how to get there. So this is sort of what you're going to see. The thing I want to point out, there are 2 code books publicly accessible. Do not use the old one because then you will be analyzing your data incorrectly. So make sure you use the most up-to-date one, please. Licensing terms and conditions, very boring. Essentially, all you really need to know is that you can do whatever you like as long as you give credit to the creators and cite the work. So that's myself and Adrian and the works associated with PIRA, because we want everyone to use it. We want it to facilitate more empirical work in the field. We want it to assist practitioners in Australia and abroad. So really, we hope that people do use it and they find it helpful, but do make sure that you give credit where credit is due. And again, here's some more links to where PIRA has been used in the past. And thanks all for listening. I really appreciate it. And for those that are on the other side of the world, go to bed. It's 3 a.m. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Emma. So just as a quick reminder, if you want to ask questions, make sure you put them into the Q&A. So first question that came in, so it's to do with policy implications. So how can PIRA be practically used by policymakers to prevent radicalization, and particularly in addressing the kind of digital threats that we see, such as online radicalization? How do you perceive it being used?
Okay, so the digital threats is a touchy subject. So as I said, when we're looking at the variables that capture that digital engagement or online engagement, they are not foolproof. So I think it's important to keep in mind that PIRA can be used as a tool to assist. It shouldn't be used as a predictive purpose. It shouldn't be used as something that essentially should be based on policy, but I think based on, it can be triangulated with other information for policymakers in understanding the types of threats. So something PIRA does as well is it captures when these individuals were exposed to the public. So you can look at how the threats have changed over time, and you can run a very basic analysis to see, are certain types of factors associated with certain type of individuals at a certain time. So it's to be used as a tool, not as something that, as I said, should guide it solely on its own, but definitely can be used as a sort of supplementary material. And the online use in particular, you could look at things like what platforms are used the most by certain individuals. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Another question we have, so did group affiliation and social networks intersect with online behaviour at all? That's the first part, so I'll get you to answer that and then I'll ask the second part.
Yeah, group networks intersect with online use.
Yes, online behaviour.
I don't know. I didn't conduct an analysis to look at that. So I actually can't answer that. I didn't run interactions between those specific things. So I would be weary to actually respond to that.
So what I would suggest to the person who asked the question is that to download the data set and see for themselves.
I can only do so much, guys. I am
Yeah.
only one person.
And then the second part of the question, was psychological isolation part of the broader impact of social isolation? And if so, what was the main takeaway?
So social isolation, the way that it was collected here, and there's a couple of other variables that look at things like, was the individual excluded from a group, like a social group? What we found is that psychological isolation wasn't necessarily linked, but the fact is that the way we captured it in and of itself, it was looking at whether they were detached from pro-social networks. And did they inherently spend a lot of time on their own, or were they sort of in a bubble where there was no one around them that was espousing perhaps more pro-social beliefs and behaviors? That in and of itself is what we found was the most significant predictor. Well, it's what I found in my research anyway, over and over again. It was, were they isolated? So I hope that answers your question a bit.
Okay. So I have a question.
Okay.
Well, I actually have a couple of questions, but the first one
good.
is, so you've made the data open access, so like PIRUS, the GTD, things like that, other data sets. Why did you choose to de-identify the cases if it's open access and actually all of this information could be built and you could do it? Because other databases out there that are open access obviously have the names included. So can you explain kind of the reasoning for the de-identification? Because that's quite rare when we're thinking about open access data sets.
Is PIRUS, I think PIRUS is de-identified.
I've seen versions of it years ago where you could get the names. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. I am actually going to go look at that now.
Yeah.
There's a couple of reasons for that. I think as well, for us, the main reason was that we didn't want it to be used as a sort of a weapon against certain types of individuals. We didn't want it to be used also for people that don't understand the inherent limitations with this type of data, could be misrepresented, misunderstood, and misused. So I think a big part of why we decided to make it de-identifiable was our purpose wasn't to, and because the data set is so small as well, as opposed to the other ones where there's thousands of cases, it runs the risk of then vilifying these individuals more, and that data being used for perhaps more malicious purposes than otherwise. We felt that that was just the best way forward to avoid any backlash, especially things like, obviously the media, and we just didn't, we wanted it to be used as an empirical tool, not sort of a, what do you call it when you, like sort of a reason for targeting certain people and then making assumptions about people based on data that inherently has a lot of limitations in it.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question. Did you find a nexus between those who were radicalised in Australia by overseas state and non-state actors, or was that not something that you guys were trying to identify?
Did not look at that specifically. That we looked at non-state actors specifically, so that wasn't, we didn't sort of look into that in a lot of detail, I'm very sorry to say.
But future, because, as the data set expands, I think the question came because there's growing interest in the role of state actors, especially in the impact in Australia. So it might be something that can be kind of drawn on in the future.
looked at more in depthly. And I think as well for us, obviously, compared to sort of other databases like the GD, that there was lots of people working on it. This was a very, very small research team. And so for us now, for us to build on it, obviously, I would love to build on it in the future. I would love to get some funding to build on it to sort of really capture those changing threats over time and expand upon it and include things that perhaps weren't included back in 2017 because they weren't maybe as relevant or weren't as prevalent. And I think that's the really interesting thing about these data sets is it sort of captures the threat base at a certain time. And the benefit is it is over a long period of time. But as we're seeing now, as the threats are changing, they're emerging, they're looking different. It's one of those things where you're sort of chasing your tail, trying to keep up with obviously how terrorism changes, not inherently, but the threats do change. So youth is a good example in Australia, particularly. So one of my students is actually looking at the difference between youth and adults and extremists in Australia, and actually looking at social media and how social media might play a larger role, if at all, and sort of how social media might work in a way of accelerating and sort of explaining those cases that we're finding where younger and younger children are getting involved in this type of rhetoric. So I would really like to sort of build on that, and then, as you said, even go and look at state actors and sort of a bit more broad. In a perfect world, that would be great.
Thank you. All right. We have a question. Are there variables that capture neurodivergence?
No. So probably another great segue into what I was just talking about. We capture mental health. And as you know, mental health is not a blanket, as I think Emily would probably know the best. In fact, she'd probably answer this better than I can. But we are seeing, neurodivergency coming up a little bit more. But for the purpose of this, we do obviously capture it in the qualitative case notes to sort of talk about the type of mental ailment or the cognitive disability or whatever it might be. But it is a very broad blanket, which is problematic in and of itself, and I'm aware of that. So I think, and that's also when it was used. So we used PIRA to sort of assess the VERA risk assessment. And one of a few of the indicators, as a lot of you probably know, look at mental health, and that is things like neurodivergency, specific types of mood disorders. So in that instance, it could be used to be very specific in the type of mental illness that they had or ailment or issue. But as the data stands publicly, no.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we've got quite an in-depth question. So I'm just going to read it how it's written because otherwise I'll mess it up. All right. So I have a question about one of the differences between PIRA and PIRUS variables. PIRA variable 13 plot prep includes people who fought overseas, not just individuals who plotted domestic attacks. However, the equivalent variable in PIRUS, number 5, attack preparation, appears to exclude foreign fighters and only include individuals who plotted domestic attacks, which complicates comparison. What was the reason for making this PIRA variable include both foreign fighting and domestic plotting? Thank you.
Great question. Okay. So, and the good thing is there is a solution to that, to not jeopardize comparisons. Good question, though. Very specific. When they said 13, I'm like, dear God, what is variables 13?
Oh, they've been looking.
Oh, they have, clearly. So the reason we included that at the time is because, so I'll start here. We had a lot of foreign fighters in general in our data set. So, and they obviously engaged in some form of preparation to leave the country and join a terrorist group. It didn't feel right to exclude them from plot prep if they did in fact prepare to engage in that type of activity. So in saying that, The reason we added it, one, was to then sort of be able to disassociate those that were more domestic and foreign based, which is actually what I did in my thesis. So I actually excluded foreign fighters from that. We have another variable that PIRUS doesn't capture, that is, were they a foreign fighter? So from that alone, and that also is broken down into 2 layers. So the best thing about foreign fighters is some of them are really successful and the others get caught at the airport. So is that person a foreign fighter? We don't know, really. So the reason for that extra variable was to go, did they plan to go overseas and were they apprehended before they could, or did they successfully actually enter a conflict zone? So again, you're able to sort of exclude and include the individuals that might not be relevant to what you're looking at. So I hope that answers your question.
I hope it does too. Okay, so another question. So how does the PIRA database distinguish between individuals experiencing socioeconomic vulnerabilities, for example, marginalization or discrimination, and those who consciously choose a path of ideological radicalization so that the data doesn't stigmatize any particular group?
Okay, give me a second. Can you repeat that question?
So I
Sorry.
think the question is, from my reading, is how do you distinguish between people who have consciously chosen like the pathway towards like an ideology and people who have kind of been experiencing vulnerabilities that may lead them in that sense to be vulnerable to other people radicalizing them.
Okay. I'm with you now. All right, good question. So obviously, I know the context around this, and so I think I know what you're saying. And it is a very tricky thing to make sure that we're capturing those nuances.
Yeah.
So for those types of instances, and particularly in the way we coded the data, it's a reason that we created case profiles before we started coding, because we wanted to get a sense of what the data actually looked like and what the best way was to code around that. So, things like the basic one, socioeconomic status, is a clear one. Things like so immigration status, when they entered Australia, if they experienced any exposure to militant warfare prior to entering Australia. So all of those things are captured. In addition to that, there's information like experiences of humiliation. And in one of the variables, what I actually decided to do without telling Adrian is I was looking at the types of grievances and the sort of significant events that might precede radicalization. So that is things like the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, the call of the caliphate, all of these, really, September 11, these big things that target a specific group of people to sort of rightly feel marginalized or attacked, or the backlash leads to marginalization. So what I did in that is I also included, instead of just events, I actually tried to capture whether events that were primarily related to things like government agencies or security intelligence and their behaviors felt that that person or their group were being marginalized by the Australian government, the American government, whoever it might be, which I was hoping would start differentiating between those types of, that exposure to vulnerability that is inherent with certain individuals and groups compared to others. So, yeah.
Thank you. All right. So I had more questions, but I'm just going to ask them when we next see each other, because we're out of time. So I would like to bring an end to the session. Thank you everyone for attending and asking questions. We hope that everything was answered to kind of your satisfaction. So just as a reminder, obviously, if you're not already an Avert member, you can join Avert to get more information about future events and join the mailing list. You can follow Avert on LinkedIn, subscribe to the YouTube channel where the recordings for these kind of webinars are held. And there are two webinars that are scheduled in the next month. So the first one is on the 24th of September, and that is, so the title is Exploring the Religious Dimensions of American Far-Right Extremist Discourse, and that is being presented by Dr. Ali Perliger, and I am hosting that one again. And then the second one is on the 22nd of October, and that's the bureaucracy of violence, organizational survival, and the challenge of disengagement. And that is a presentation by Nell Bennett. So you can sign up to both of those webinars on the Avert website. And thank you all so much for coming today. And I hope you have a fab day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening.